Brazil was almost French. For more than 30 years, it was the French who traveled the most along the Brazilian coast, trading with natives, extracting Brazil wood, and openly challenging the Portuguese crown. Portugal saw its largest territory slipping through its fingers. And worst of all, they didn't have enough people to do anything about it. Each ship that left for Brazil took 40 days to arrive, which was more than enough time for a Frenchman to land, negotiate, fill his ship with Brazil wood, and set off for another destination. Portuguese America was practically abandoned, and there was only one man to deal with it. King João III needed to manage an empire in crisis with limited manpower and great ambitions. And that's how he makes a series of decisions that forever changed the history of the Portuguese Empire, of Brazil, and even of the whole world, ranging from the founding of cities to the core of the Counter-Reformation movement that would shake all of Europe. In today's video, we are going to discuss the reign of Dom João III and analyze why he can be considered the one truly responsible for creating Portuguese Brazil. But before we start the video, if you enjoy our content, become a member of our channel right now. That way, you'll have access to our group and exclusive content, including live classes, so you can dive even deeper into the hidden side of history. To understand how Dom João created Brazil, we need to understand the empire he inherited. His father, Dom Manuel, had designed the Portuguese Empire as a thalassocratic empire, that is, a maritime empire. The Kingdom of Portugal, with only 1 million inhabitants, did not have much manpower. So it decided to dominate the trade routes, profiting from trade, freight, and tolls at important trading posts. And when Dom Manuel dies, his son João takes the crown at the height of its expansion and glory. In Asia, Afonso de Albuquerque manages to establish a veritable monopoly in the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese controlled the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, Hormuz, and Malacca, and had already reached the Spice Islands. And it is this rising kingdom that João inherits. João, who saw his father's architectural works, with the splendor of the Jerónimos Monastery and the Belém Tower, and also saw figures like Gil Vicente enchanting the Portuguese court. But under the weight of his father's glories, João also inherited a huge problem. How could he keep the machinery of the empire running and maintain the territorial expansions that cost so many human lives with such a small population? Weren't there many ships that simply sank on the way to India? Since there were so few Portuguese to control so many outposts, occupying Brazil proved to be an almost impossible mission. And that's when France comes into play. The French didn't have a navy strong enough to challenge Castile, and in fact they lost many wars to them throughout Europe. But Francis, I knew that his kingdom had more than 10 times the population of Portugal, and he realized that Portuguese America was practically abandoned by its own crown. In this way, France began to send expeditions to the coast of the territory in order to trade with the natives, and above all, to extract Brazil wood. Thus, Portugal began to see Europe flooded with a valuable product that, in theory, existed only in its lands, but they weren't the ones trading it. In other words, the French were explicitly stealing from the Portuguese. And even though the crown sent coastal patrol expeditions to try to capture foreign ships that were on its coast, it was very difficult most of the time for these ships to actually cross paths. In other words, many times, in the 40 days it took for a Portuguese ship to reach Brazilian territory, there was already enough time for a French ship to dock, negotiate, fill the boat with cargo, and leave for another destination. In this way, faced with all these problems, the king needed to take action. Portugal needed to occupy Brazil in some way, and Brazil was a huge territory with almost 10 times more coastline than Portugal. But if the king founded cities in the north, the French would settle in the south. If the king settled at the edges, they would occupy the center. The goal was to occupy the entire territory at once. Thus, João decides to replicate the model that had been implemented in the Azores and on Madeira Island, the Hereditary Captaincy model. In this way, the king delegates 15 captaincies to 12 men, with some of them even being territorially larger than the Kingdom of Portugal itself. And the captaincy system worked almost like feudalism, where the captain could subdivide his lands into sesmaria grants. However, even though they were hereditary, the land still remained as a concession from the king. This prevented the creation of duchies, marches, or counties in the New World that would lead to an unnecessary strengthening of the Portuguese nobility. However, despite the division into captaincies, these began to fail terribly. Aires de Cunha, captain of Rio Grande, died in a shipwreck while trying to occupy his lands. However, others, like Vasco Fernandes Coutinho from Espírito Santo, died bankrupt after trying, despite all his efforts, to make his captaincy prosper. Another, like Pero do Campo Turino from Porto Seguro, was overthrown by his own men, and others, like Francisco Pereira Coutinho, ended up being devoured in a cannibalistic ritual. Only 2 captaincies prospered, which was not enough to protect and occupy such a large territory. And, in addition to that, day after day, a large number of enslaved Brazilian natives arrived, especially to perform domestic work in Portugal. This soon motivated Pope Paul III to issue the Bull Sublimus Deus, in which he not only condemned the enslavement of indigenous people, but also declared any act to that effect null and void. And this bull stuck in the mind of Dom João III like no other. João was known for being an extremely Catholic and pious king. He prayed frequently, and unlike many kings of his time, had no lovers. A year earlier, he had continued Dom Manuel's policy and definitively established the Holy Office. In Portugal, officially persecuting people considered heretics and censoring texts that went against the Catholic faith. But instead of being praised by the Pope for combating heresy, he was warned because of the enslavement of the natives. Portugal did not make a significant missionary effort, and the kingdom had a large deficit in formal education. And, as the very content of the bull made clear, Portugal was not concerned with spreading the gospel, claiming that the natives were not capable of understanding it. But, interestingly, it was Portugal that, at that time, did not have the capacity to teach. Despite the glories and military conquests, most of the country did not have any educational system, and even at the university level, there was only one university. Thus, according to the article on Jesuit education in Portugal, in the year 1539, the king had already expressed the desire for some religious order to send missionaries to Christianize the new territories conquered by Portugal overseas. In his mindset, he saw that the expansion of the empire should go hand in hand with the expansion of Christianity and also with formal education, thus fulfilling the will of the Pope. And it was then that Dom João heard about a group of students and priests who wanted to found a new order in Europe, dedicated not to monasteries and contemplation, but to teaching and apologetic preaching. Its founder, Ignatius of Loyola, was a former soldier who also implemented much of the military discipline among the members of the order. And that was exactly what the King of Portugal was looking for. He thus uses his ambassador in Rome to facilitate the recognition of this new order, called the Society of Jesus, by the Pope. And then, he makes sure to recruit the order to act urgently in Portugal. The king decides to permanently establish the university in Coimbra, no longer moving it.
Entre Coimbra e Lisboa.
He also starts funding Portuguese students at the Sorbonne, at the University of Paris, with scholarships to transform higher education in Portugal. In fact, among the scholarship recipients was Simão Rodrigues, a Portuguese who was co-founder of the Society of Jesus alongside St. Ignatius of Loyola. And with Dom João III, Portugal was the first country in Europe to recognize and support Jesuit expeditions throughout the entire empire. To Asia, they sent none other than St. Francis Xavier, who did remarkable work in the Christianization of India and Japan. In Brazil, figures like Father José de Anchieta, also a Jesuit, stand out. In 1555, at just 21 years old, he developed a work called Artes da Gramática da Língua Mais Usada na Costa do Brasil, to try to systematize the learning of the Tupi language by the Jesuits. And another important step taken by the king was the centralization of the Order of Christ in his own person. For a long time, the administrator of the Order of Christ and the King of Portugal were different people, and each one held enormous power. Dom João II even went so far as to assassinate the head of the order for conspiracy. But with Dom João III, the crown effectively took control of the mastership of the Order of Christ. And João decides to dedicate the resources of the order to spread the Jesuit order overseas. Thus, it was with the sponsorship of the Order of Christ that the Jesuits reached the most distant corners of the planet. During the reign of Dom João, the Portuguese would reach Macau, establishing a permanent port in China, and would also arrive in Japan for the first time. And in Brazil, they would found schools, towns, and villages that would solidify the Portuguese presence among the native Brazilians. And at the same time that he was funding these priests, João decided to centralize the administration of Brazil. The king orders the creation of a planned city to defend that vast territory, and also orders the establishment of a central administration. Thus, in 1549, Tomé de Souza founded the city of São Salvador da Bahia de Todos os Santos. The city would have walls, fortifications, and cannons ready to spit fire at any foreigner who tried to invade the territory. In addition, Salvador would later serve as a strategic port for ship repairs, with the Portuguese establishing the Ribeira das Naus shipyard in Salvador there, and with Tomé de Souza himself already bringing many carpenters and shipbuilders with him for this purpose. Dom João III, therefore, is a forgotten king, but a very interesting one. His reign marks a transition from a policy of controlling strategic points to a policy of territorial expansion. For many historians and liberals like Alexandre Herculano, he is a fanatical and reactionary king who persecuted new Christians and destroyed the order of Christ. And for others, he is the king who encouraged education and the missionary spirit of Portugal like no other. But whatever the opinion about his reign, one conclusion is undeniable. Dom João II was the one who secured the territory of Brazil through the Treaty of Tordesillas. Dom Manuel was the one who financed Cabral's voyage of discovery. But it was Dom João III who actually laid the foundations of Brazil. He was the one who, faced with an impossible, immense threatened territory, without roads and without cities, made decisions that would shape this country's future. The hereditary captaincies, even with their failures, created the logic of occupying the territory. Salvador was created as a royal project by a king who understood that dominating Brazil was a matter of survival for the empire. And the Jesuits, in turn, documented languages, founded schools, and stitched together the cultural fabric that would become Brazilian civilization. João, in fact, never set foot in Brazil. It was his personality and his decisions that, from hundreds of leagues away, drew the map of Brazil and forever laid the foundations of its territorial unity. And did you know about the reign of Dom João III? What surprised you the most? So leave your comment right now to support our work, and take the opportunity to become a member of the channel right now. That way, you'll be able to dive deeper and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history